The meeting was arranged with an unusual urgency. HR was already seated when I walked in, and the atmosphere had the weight of something rehearsed. My boss cleared his throat and delivered his verdict with practiced confidence. He said the issue was my attitude, a word dropped into the air like a stone. It was broad and comfortable for him to use, yet impossible for me to respond to without appearing defensive. I watched the room carefully. HR avoided my eyes. My boss leaned back, as if his role were complete. There was a silence that stretched far longer than anyone expected. I felt every second of it, but I refused to rush into their narrative. People over 50 understand the value of measured breathing, especially when younger leaders expect instant surrender. I kept my voice steady and answered with a single word. I said, "Understood." Then I lifted my folder, flipped it open, and asked the only question that mattered. I requested the copy of my personnel file that supported the claim being made. The temperature in the room changed so quickly that it felt physical. HR's pen stopped moving. My boss blinked twice, suddenly unsure of what process required from him. No one had prepared for a direct request grounded in documentation rather than emotion. The silence that followed was not simple surprise. It was recognition. They knew the accusation had no foundation beyond convenience. They knew the meeting had been designed for compliance, not clarity. That silence told me more than their words ever could. It told me the balance of power had shifted before they realized what had happened. Attitude is a useful word for leaders who prefer authority without accountability. It sounds official, yet it carries no requirement for evidence. It suggests a problem while hiding the absence of real documentation. People with years of experience have seen this tactic before, usually delivered when your competence becomes inconvenient for those who want control without challenge. A manager cannot dispute decades of steady performance, so they reach for language that cannot be measured. They choose terms that sound behavioral rather than operational. Attitude becomes the substitute for metrics they forgot to track. It becomes the explanation when your work is stronger than their expectations. It allows them to create distance between your results and their discomfort. Those over 50 know this pattern well. It is the word used when you are not easily intimidated. It appears when your presence disrupts shortcuts. It rises when your calm decision-making contrasts with impulsive leadership. Attitude is not about disposition. It is about hierarchy. It is used to remind you that someone else wants the final word, even if they lack the record to support it. By naming this tactic clearly, you reclaim the clarity they hope to avoid. You understand that the accusation is not personal. It is structural. When experience enters the room, insecurity often follows. Younger leaders sometimes rely on broad statements because they have not lived enough consequences to respect precision. Recognizing this allows you to step back emotionally and step forward strategically. Instead of reacting, you document. Instead of defending yourself, you request proof. Once the conversation moves into the realm of written facts, the word attitude loses all its power. It becomes exactly what it always was, an empty placeholder for something they could not justify. A personnel file is not a collection of impressions. It is not a place for opinions or shifting moods. It is the formal record of an employee's professional journey inside an organization. It holds dates that mark specific events. It contains signatures that confirm discussions took place. It includes written warnings if concerns were ever raised in a legitimate way. Every page reflects a documented process rather than a subjective feeling. Most people over 50 understand paperwork better than any performance slogan. They know structure is what protects both sides from improvised decisions. That is why asking for the file is not an act of aggression. It is a return to procedure. It brings the conversation back to a place where evidence matters more than preference. It transforms an emotional accusation into a request for facts. When you ask for your file, you are simply asking to see the history they claim exists. If the accusation is real, the record will show it. If the accusation is convenient, the record will remain empty. The organization knows this. HR knows it even more because their responsibility is accuracy, not loyalty to a narrative. The moment you make the request, the room shifts. You are no longer defending yourself. You are inviting verification. You are placing the weight of truth on documentation rather than on performance theater. People who rely on vague language suddenly feel exposed because the file separates reality from interpretation. A personnel file is the quiet witness of a career. It cannot be edited in the middle of a crisis. It either exists with structure or reveals its own silence. And silence in a file speaks louder than any accusation delivered in a meeting. After the meeting, I expected a simple email attachment. Nothing complicated. Just a file that should have been available within minutes. Instead, the first day passed without a reply. The second day arrived with new calendar invitations that replaced our usual check-ins. Meetings shifted without explanation. People who once spoke easily now measured every word. The silence grew heavier with each passing hour. HR did not follow up. My manager avoided the hallway. The language around me changed from confident statements to hesitant phrases. Concerns became misunderstandings. Decisions became temporary adjustments. No one mentioned the request directly, yet everything in the building reacted to it. For an audience over 50, this silence is instantly recognizable. It is the quiet that follows a question someone cannot answer honestly. It is the pause that appears when structure is missing. It is the space where truth waits to be acknowledged. I did not insist. I did not chase anyone. I allowed the silence to work on its own. While the office shifted into cautious motion, I continued my routine. I documented my work. I kept my conversations brief and written. I moved through my tasks without forcing confrontation. The absence of documentation began to reveal itself more powerfully than any argument I could have made. By the end of the week, the silence no longer belonged to me. It belonged to them. It exposed the gap between their claim and the reality of my record. It placed responsibility on the people who had spoken too quickly and prepared too little. Sometimes the strongest pressure is created by stillness. And in that stillness, the truth often rises without a single raised voice. The turning point did not arrive with an announcement. It revealed itself during a short meeting where HR finally addressed my request. They sat across from me with a folder that should have carried weight, yet it looked unusually thin. The representative opened it carefully as if hoping something new had appeared since the last review. Inside were routine forms and annual acknowledgments, but there were no indications of concern, no patterns of misconduct, no statements that supported the accusation I had been given. I watched their expression change. It was subtle at first, then unmistakable. They realized the decision made in that earlier room had not followed procedure. They understood that a verbal judgment had been presented as a final conclusion without the documentation required to protect the company. The issue no longer lived between my manager and me. It now belonged to the system responsible for accuracy. For people over 50, this moment is familiar. Experience teaches that institutions move slowly until they sense exposure. Once that awareness appears, priorities shift. HR began asking questions about timelines and conversations. They requested clarifications from my manager. They searched for written records that simply did not exist. The risk moved away from me and settled firmly on the shoulders of those who had acted without foundation. HR's role changed from observing to containing. They needed to protect the organization from a decision that lacked structure. In that moment, the dynamic of power quietly shifted. What began as an accusation transformed into a procedural problem, and the responsibility for that problem no longer belonged to me. After HR recognized the absence of documentation, the atmosphere around me changed without a single announcement. Power does not always move through confrontation. Sometimes it shifts through silence, consistency, and careful structure. I continued my work with steady professionalism. Every task was recorded. Every communication was written. Every decision I made was supported with clear reasoning. I did not seek sympathy or confrontation. I simply maintained the habits that protect experienced workers when leadership becomes uncertain. My manager began avoiding direct interaction. Emails arrived instead of spoken instructions. Meetings that once included heavy commentary now contained brief summaries. The confidence used to criticize me dissolved into caution. It became clear that leadership had lost the ability to rely on assumptions. They understood that I was operating within documented boundaries while they were navigating decisions without support. For viewers over 50, this pattern is instantly recognizable. Power in the workplace does not always belong to the loudest voice. It often belongs to the person who respects procedure, especially when others forget it exists. As I continued to move through my responsibilities, the authority in the situation subtly migrated in my direction. Colleagues began coming to me for stability. HR communicated with measured respect. My manager's presence grew smaller each day, not through conflict, but through accountability. The shift was quiet but unmistakable. The structure that once seemed to work against me became a shield. The very rules they ignored were now shaping the outcome. Without raising my voice or challenging anyone, the balance of influence changed. In the absence of noise, control returned to the person who had stayed patient, prepared, and documented. The shift in attitude began quietly. Meetings that once carried an air of firmness now opened with cautious greetings. My manager avoided direct statements and preferred to speak in general terms. HR scheduled a follow-up conversation and entered with a noticeably softer tone. They used words like review and clarification, as if the earlier decision had simply been a misunderstanding. The certainty that had filled the room during the demotion had disappeared. I listened without interrupting. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that the absence of documentation had changed everything. They could not justify the demotion without evidence, and they knew the record provided none. HR tried to present the situation as an opportunity to reassess expectations. My manager attempted to frame it as a communication issue. Both avoided acknowledging the real reason for the shift in tone. I did not argue or demand restitution. I observed. I let them fill the silence with explanations that circled around their own discomfort. Experience teaches that when people realize they cannot defend their actions, they begin to rewrite their intentions. What once sounded decisive now sounded hesitant. What once appeared confident now sounded uncertain. By the end of the conversation, the demotion was no longer presented as final. It became a topic for future evaluation. A path for restoration emerged, not as a concession to me, but as a correction of their own process. I thanked them calmly and left the room understanding something they had not yet admitted. The moment I asked for the file, the outcome had already started to change. If you are over 50, this part is for you. The workplace often rewards speed, noise, and image. Many younger managers grow comfortable with opinions presented as facts because they have not yet faced the consequences of careless decisions. You have lived long enough to know that structure is the real foundation of authority. Experience is not a performance. It is a record. It is a lifetime of choices that created consistency long before anyone questioned your value. When someone judges you without evidence, resist the instinct to argue emotionally. Let the process speak. Ask for the documentation that supports their claim. If it exists, you will see it. If it does not, their silence will reveal more than any defense you could ever make. Your strength comes from patience, clarity, and the knowledge that time has taught you how to stand without raising your voice. Never forget that calm is not weakness. It is strategy. It keeps you from reacting to words designed to provoke. It protects you from decisions made in haste. It places responsibility back on the people who created the situation. In truth, the request for your file is not a confrontation. It is a mirror. It reflects whether their judgment is rooted in fact or an impulse. Hold your confidence even when others attempt to diminish it. Experience does not need applause. It needs accuracy. When you choose structure over emotion, you remind the workplace that maturity carries its own form of authority. And in most cases, the silence that follows your request will reveal the truth more clearly than any explanation they attempt to give.